So the way I would structure my talk and our interaction, as I thought, would be the following. I'll first tell you what I know about environmental situation in Russia, like what kind of environmental challenges are out there, what is being done, then what is not being done. I'll tell you a few more facts and stories about environmental and climate activism in Russia. Then I also, since the main topic of the week is food, water, and sustainability, I also touch more specifically on those particular topics. And then I'll be open to any questions. I'm also open to any questions like throughout this talk, and we will see them in the chat, I hope. And but I'll also be happy to answer any more specific questions, say, relating to COP26, so the UN Climate Conference that you might have later on, like just as a fresh comer. I was also trying to make it not very formal, even though I will have a presentation. I was also trying to add a lot of personal facts, not just give you very dry facts and figures and statistics, but also somehow enrich it and enlighten it with my personal experience of someone living in Russia and someone experiencing what I'll be telling you about on a daily basis. So, and with this, let me start sharing my screen. Yeah, okay, a minute. Oh, great, okay. So, right, environmental situation in Russia. Since organizers have informed me that not all of you are actually experts on Russia, and not all of you have been really that much interaction with Russia, I thought that I would start with a few very basic and interesting facts, which will be also useful to us throughout our talk. And this is first well, the obvious map of the world, which shows us where Russia is. We will actually be returning to the map quite a while during our talk. I don't know if you can actually see my mouse. I forgot if you do that in Zoom, but yes, you see, I see you nodding, Meredith. So, but just to show where I am. So I normally, so right at this very moment, I'm still in London, but normally I live in St. Petersburg, which is in the western part of Russia. It's a former capital of the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union, and now is the second largest city. It's located on the Gulf of Finland, which is part of the Baltic Sea, and it's right here. So it's almost like the very western edge of the country. But throughout my talk, we'll be traveling to various parts of the country, from here to the main oil regions of the country, and also the very far east of the country to Kamchatka Peninsula and to Sakhalin Island here. Many more stories to come. So here are some basic, however useful, and I find interesting facts about the country. As it is at the moment, I would pay your attention to the fact, to the population dynamics, which Russia has been having in the last few decades. Ever since late 70s, early 80s, well, Russia at that time still part of the Soviet Union, but then also as an independent state, has been having declining demographics. So the population of Russia is going down, even with the migration, even with many people coming to live in Russia, mainly and work in Russia, mainly from the former other Soviet Union republics, now independent states of Central Asia. Russian population is going down, and it's actually one of the few countries in the world where it's happening. So it's a very important trend, which also forms Russian economy and Russian model of socioeconomic development in many ways. Another very important aspect is that Russia's economy is considered, well, I write here eighth. According to various estimations, it can be seventh or eighth or ninth largest economy in the world. And sometimes Russia's economy is being compared to economy and like GDP of California, if we compare it in US terms. So it can be comparable with that respect. In terms of ecosystems and like various nature zones which we experience in Russia, as we will see also later on the map, Russia is a pretty northern country. We'll talk later about the population distribution. But in more general, I think, I mean, if you study in a school in Russia and you study geography, very often they tell you that like Russia is in so many ways is to be compared with the US. However, the southern border of Russia lies almost where the northern border of the US lies. So just to kind of, obviously Eurasia functions differently in terms of climate and geography and many other trends, and say for the areas including St. Petersburg and even Murmansk, which is here, I'll say Gulf Stream plays a great role, but still it can be an interesting comparison. Now, this is an interesting map which shows us distribution of Russia's population. And in the notes to this presentation, you will find all the sources for all of this data. And as you see, so the darker the color, the more people you have, like the dark red color is where people live. And the dark green color is actually very few people live, or hardly anyone lives. And here you can see how unevenly Russia's population is distributed. So you see that around 2/3 of Russians, so the Ural Mountains, which divide Europe and Asia, are located approximately here. And you see that 2/3 of Russian population actually lives in the European part, and only 1/3 lives in the Asian part. And people migrating further from the eastern part of Russia to western part of Russia is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge to eastern part being depopulated, and they're now trying on the governmental level to introduce a number of programs which would bring people back to, say, the far east of the country, and far east is everything like this part of country. You'll probably, I've seen that in Western academia, they just call all of this part Siberia, but like within Russian geographical and other academic context, we would only really call this part Siberia, and this part is already what we call the far east of Russia. So there are a number of attempts to bring more people to the far east of Russia, and even create new cities, like new mega cities. This is all in discussion. Another very interesting fact, and we'll get to that also a bit later, is that while most of people live here, and this is also where traditionally Russians have been living for centuries, it is this part of the country which currently brings most of its wealth, and it is this part of the country which currently has most of its natural resources. It would be anything from water to forests of wood and wood products, timber, from oil and gas, metals, almost whatever you look at, like Siberia and the Far East would be it. Fish and also many other resources. And that's obviously like a large balance and disbalance. Very interesting to note it. So there are a number of, like, speaking now more specifically about environmental situation, environmental problems. So there are, I'll take a brief historic approach here. So a number of environmental problems actually date back to the Soviet Union times. And just also to give you an, I don't know, maybe a bit of a personal touch. So I was actually born in 1978. So I was still born when the Soviet Union was there. And I was 7 when I went to my first primary school. And this is when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. And this is when the whole system started changing. And I saw the system collapse. I saw the system change. And throughout my lifetime, I've somehow always thought that living through this historic change is probably the most important historic event in my life, like if we speak about global history and personal history. However, now with the COVID-19 in place, I think, I mean, the pandemic is probably also the second most important, or maybe the first most important in my life. But anyway, so I've seen some of the Soviet Union, and I've also seen the country change in the 80s, in the 90s, in 2000s. And I often have a feeling like there's so much changing on a regular basis that it's very often, there was one kind of country in the 80s, another kind of country in the 90s, and now it's something completely different. Some things change for the worse, some change for the better, and we'll also speak more specifically about that later on. But yeah, the country keeps changing. So when we speak about environmental problems which were inherited from the Soviet Union, there are still quite a number of the so-called, I mean, it was a direct translation from Russia. I call it accumulated pollution from industrial facility. It is something which in the US is often being done with the Superfund grants and subsidies. In Russia, there's a similar program. And I just wanted to show you this picture. I actually took it myself. So that's a picture from the very far east of Russia. Let me just quickly go to a map. So that is a picture from here. That's the site. So that's Kamchatka Peninsula, one of the most one of the most eastern ends of Russia, probably like the most eastern end. And Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky is the capital. And around Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, which is located in a gulf next to the ocean, you actually see quite a lot of abandoned ships. And I just took this picture of abandoned ships in January this year because I felt like it was like a magnificent imagery. It looked very beautiful. On the other hand, it also demonstrated the remains of large empire which was once there, and a completely different economic system which used to run these ships and use these ships. And now it's all changed. Now the basis of economy in the region, which used to have a lot of industry and a lot of like other areas, is just basically fish, caviar, and gold. So, and well, growing tourism now as well. But just I felt like that view was somehow breathtaking for me, and I wanted to share it with you. But speaking more specifically about the like that particular problem, so there are still quite a number of similar sites, and actually some very nasty and dirty sites, which have a lot of waste, like industrial waste and chemical waste from the Soviet industry. And in some cases, such sites have been dealt with. In some cases, they're still out there. So this is the not so good heritage which we got from the Soviet Union times. So those would be, so to say, one level of the problem. Now, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed and the economic system changed, we had quite a number of new environmental problems appearing, some of them combining with what we had before, but some of them also like bringing new environmental challenges. And I mentioned here air pollution as the first one. So if you look at some world statistics for air pollution, Russia usually doesn't come very well. And you see Russia, well, maybe not in the red zone, but at least in the orange zone. However, if we go back to this map, we realize that, well, air pollution might probably be quite bad where there are a lot of people, but then in this area, like all of this area would have almost like the purest air ever on Earth. But also if you travel to, say, even from St. Petersburg, somewhere like, say, I don't know, 300 miles down south, and you come to a region which is called Pskov region, this is this part of it. Even though it has quite a lot of people living there, there's hardly industry, and also all the towns are very small, and there's not much traffic. So they actually have, like, there the air quality would again be quite good. So the very specifics of Russia is that most Russia-wide figures just don't work. In the case of Russia, as well as in the case of the US, it's also a very large country, you have to be as specific as possible, and you have to go as local as possible. And this is why air pollution and air pollution figures, they vary greatly. Say, if we speak about large cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, or other cities in European part of Russia, the main cause for air pollution would be transport sector, so cars. In many ways, these cities, when they were built or rebuilt during the Soviet years, they did not foresee so many cars going down the streets because people didn't have private cars in that amount as we have now. And so in many ways, this is the reason for traffic jams. This is the reason for air pollution. Because in most large cities in European part of Russia, industry has been either taken out of the city or it has died throughout the economic transformation. Now, there are still some cities in southern Ural part of Russia and also southern Siberia, like this part. There are still a few cities which have like more than around 1 million inhabitants. or around. And many of them have coal generation, which is a large contributing factor to air pollution, while most of energy generation in European part of Russia would be natural gas based. Here it's mostly coal. And also some of the cities still have quite a lot of industry like mining or metal production, steel, aluminium, and this obviously also brings like very negative consequences for the air pollution. So as we see, it varies. Now, water pollution. We'll speak a bit more specifically about water later on. I would just like to mention here that most problems connected with water are water contamination coming from old or dilapidated urban water infrastructure, say water purifying facilities or sewage facilities or water treatment facilities in some places have not been renovated since the 70s or the 80s, and that's like the main issue. In some places, it's also industrial discharges, like illegal industrial discharges, which is still quite an issue. But overall, yeah, water issue would be this. Now, a really large issue, also probably issue number one in public discourse, would be waste management. And when I say waste problem, I do not actually mean that Russian cities have waste in the streets. It's more about that most of the cities are surrounded by a ring. Well, in case of Moscow, it will really be a ring of landfills where 95% of all Russian waste is being taken to. There were various estimates that the total area of all Russian landfills, which also appeared over the last 20 years, equals to 1/4 of all Russia nature protected areas, which, as you can imagine, is huge. Now, why is that happening? Here, once again, a lot had to do with the change in economic structure and introduction of the so-called Western products and Western packaging. I still remember, like in the 80s, we didn't have plastic bags. I mean, that would probably be quite a surprise for you. And when they first appeared, my mom used to wash them because they were so precious. I mean, now it's obviously someone would never do. Like there's a lot of disposable things in our every life. So we basically encountered the same problems that many other European or North American countries have experienced in their history, and that is increase of consumption, well, increase of well-being, increase of consumption of disposable goods, and very intense and very fast growth of the amount of waste being generated by the households. So there is something being done to address this problem. I will address that a bit later. So far, most of it goes to landfills, some incineration, and the recycling rates are still low, but the sector has been developing. But yeah, I'll tell you a bit more about that. Forestry management. Well, Russia has vast forest resources. We will not speak, sorry, I'll just show you something else. We will not speak more so specifically about the forestry sector during this talk. But in my recommended reading materials, I actually included one of the reports of which I was also one of the authors, and that is reports on land use and forestry sector in Russia. That was prepared for one Paris-based think tank who works in like across the globe, and we did the study of the Russian forest. And just to show you a few useful graphs and a few useful data sets from this study, which I thought were really interesting because we actually did quite a lot of data analysis for this study. Russia has the largest area of boreal forest, like northern forests on the planet. And in comparison to the rainforest, while they grow slower, they also have a different pattern of sequestrating carbon, CO2. You also see where forest areas are located in Russia. And so basically, like all of this, like light green area would be, with darker green parts would be taiga. And everything here, which is white in the map, would be tundra. Tundra has very little, very like short-living trees. So, but the main, really largest forestry sectors with forestry used for economic purposes would either be northwest of Russia here, or southern Siberia and south of the far east of Russia. So those would be the main forestry area in terms of the economic sector. I will share that study with you, as well as a number of other studies and papers with a lot of good graphs and pictures and maps, which I hope you'll be able to use. So now we're switching back to our main presentation. And right, so forestry, nature protected areas. Russia have been having, well, for many years, like one of the largest area of nature protected areas in its territory. However, now, recently, there have been a number of new threats appearing to these areas, especially the nature protected areas, which are located in very lucrative from the touristic point of view parts of Russia, that is, say, southern Russia or south of the far east of Russia, which have very mild and favorable climate. They risk losing a lot of these territories due to tourism expansion and ski resorts, but also other resorts and nature protected areas which are located, say, next to large cities. And there's an ongoing trend of growing urbanization in Russia, with more and more people moving from rural areas in small cities to larger cities. So these larger cities also continue growing. Like if you would come to Moscow on a train from somewhere, after going through many villages with very few houses, you suddenly come to a place which looks like, I don't even know, like Shanghai or something. Like there's a whole ring of newly built housing with 20, 30, 40 storied houses, all apartments around Moscow, and the city just keep growing. They've recently increased Moscow area by 2.5 times, taking away some parts of other regions away. Moscow is a true monster in terms of geography and in terms of urban development, also in terms of economy. So much in Russia is concentrated around its capital, which is also not sustainable in terms of environment, in terms of social development, in terms of economy. But you see a similar picture around many other areas in Russia when the cities, like large cities, keep on growing, and then nature protected areas around them, or even like green zones around them, get cut down for the sake of building housing and infrastructure. So climate change is obviously a very big challenge for Russia. For many years, it was an issue which was not taken seriously. It was not taken seriously by the politicians, by the companies, also by the general public. Now, I would say the situation has changed greatly. And now it's something which is spoken about, like Russian politicians speak a lot about it, that they accept that climate change is taking place very quick in Russia. It's actually in Russian Arctic, it's taking place 2.5 times faster than everywhere else in the world. Like Arctic is warming, Arctic ice is shrinking, and Arctic waters are getting warmer. So, and Russia has already been experiencing a lot of negative effects of climate change, from droughts and sandstorms in the south of Russia. I'll just go back to the map now. So that would be like these parts of Russia, and also these parts of Russia experience quite a lot of droughts in summer and sandstorms, to like storms, very strong winds throughout the country, many floods in this part of the country, like coming from the Pacific region. Also many parts, many new floods and more frequent floods and more severe floods in Siberian part of the country. Melting permafrost, which is a huge global issue. So permafrost would probably be an area around here, like some parts would have soil frozen summer and winter. In some parts of this, permafrost melts down a bit in summer, but in general, how deep it gets frozen, like the depth of this frozen layer, it gets thinner and thinner. And around many of these peninsulas, like this one and this one, there have been so-called methane holes appearing, which you probably read in the news. So this is indeed a very worrying global process, worrying not only for Russia, because Russia has some infrastructure built on permafrost, including some cities and some gas and oil infrastructure, but it's also obviously very bad news for the global humanity, because permafrost produces negative, like positive feedback effect, meaning the more severe consequences of climate change are, the warmer it gets, then the more we experience permafrost melting, which releases a lot of methane and CO2, and thus makes climate change worse. We actually have the same trend and the same feedback loop in case of forest fires. And for the last few years, the forest fires in Russia have been really fierce and have been really severe. So most of them in Siberia. So basically parts of Siberia, especially southern Siberia, it burns throughout early May to late October. But this summer there were forest fires, wildfires, even in this part of Russia, so like Karelia, and which is very uncommon because these forests have been traditionally more humid, and there were many more rainfall, much more rainfall in summer. However, that summer was also different. You probably don't often get it in the news because very often where wildfires are taking place, there's hardly anyone living. So most direct human related risks from wildfires at the moment would be smog. And say the capital of Yakutia, Yakutsk, was in smog for a few weeks this summer. Likewise, Krasnoyarsk, likewise many other cities across Russia. And this is obviously a very, very important trend, very important problem for Russia as well. And then I already mentioned unsustainable urban development, which takes place throughout the country. And this also obviously poses a number of environmental challenges and environmental risks, worsening air pollution, worsening water pollution, but also bringing a very large impact to waste management issues and generating more waste. So what is that being done? Well, there's actually something being done in the country about it. And in general, I have to say, I've been writing about these topics and I've been talking about these topics in Russia since about 2008, 2009. And I remember at those times, those were still very marginal topics. Environmental topic, but also climate topic, those were topics considered to be unimportant. Like very often a reaction to what I was writing and I was telling was that it's the problem which worries mostly people in Western countries, but we still have to build our economy back and we still have to provide more decent living for people and care about immediate future. But then the situation started changing. And I believe there were a number of factors which contributed to it, from the growth in global importance of environmental and climate issues to, like I have here youth mentioned, right? Like many young people in Russia, they just look what's happening elsewhere. They believe that climate change is real. They totally agree with what Greta Thunberg was saying. And so for them, those issues are super important, and they very often come to me and they ask me, what is it that I can do, and also what is it, how I can make environmental situation better? Is sustainable consumption enough? Is responsible consumption enough? Or can we do any political changes? What kind of change of Russia's economy structure is needed? Because Russia's economy is so much dependent on oil and gas. What happens in a few decades when many other countries who now buy oil and gas from Russia will actually stop doing this? So what expects our country? So I would say I've experienced a great change in environmental awareness in Russia over the last, say, 5 years. Particularly climate awareness has been on the rise in the last 2-3 years. And yeah, so in a way, it feels like it's a very rewarding sector to be in, because now there's a lot of happening and there's a lot of demand for environmental information. So there's some ongoing environmental legislation reform. I would not go too deeply into it, but basically the state and the authorities are concerned with environmental problems, the ones I was telling you about. So they're trying to make air cleaner in a number of places. They're trying to also renovate water treatment facilities. They are trying to invest into new infrastructure. They're also trying to make the waste reform and encourage recycling and encourage separate waste collection. It's not always going very smoothly, and here I mentioned quite a number of factors why it's not going so smoothly, including like being slow, including influence of powerful lobby groups who benefit a lot from current situation, including corruption. But still there's a trend. I mean, environment and ecology as a word is not anymore considered to be a strange word in Russia. It's common, everyone worries about it, people worry about it, politicians worry about it, regional governments worry about it. So there's a lot happening. And what we've also seen more recently is the rise of the grassroots civil society movements across the country who work on environmental problems and who build campaigns, and some of them even successful campaigns. And with this, I'm also switching to something else. All right. So before we proceed, and this would be like the second part of my talk, and now I'm switching to the second topic, which is environmental civil society groups in Russia and environmental civil society movements. So it's very often when you probably read in the news something about civil society or non-governmental organization in Russia, you only really read bad news. And that is also part of the current situation, part of what the current situation is like at the moment. So a lot of civil society groups and a lot of non-governmental organizations have really been under pressure from the state authorities, especially the ones who have been getting their finance from abroad, like from elsewhere. There was a so-called foreign agent legislation introduced, which said that any NGO or group, or now also a person who receives funding from elsewhere is engaged in political activities, can be announced as a foreign agent, and they will have to label themselves like this. They will have to submit a lot of reports to the state, a lot of accounting reports, and they cannot cooperate with the regional authorities or other authorities. So there are a lot of limitations, and it actually makes the work of such NGOs really hard. So many organizations just had to close down and or get themselves registered as new organizations. So there are a number of like legislation in place which kind of tries to put the non-governmental sector more under control and take away any and like prohibit any foreign financing for such activities in Russia. However, there are still organizations which are working and which are also getting funding from abroad. In a way, the way this legislation is used in Russia, that it's not used against everyone. It's just used against particular individuals or organizations which are considered to be dangerous for someone, or which make life difficult for someone who has the power, someone who has the authority. So unfortunately, it's being used very selectively. And this is also another important factor. But in general, I list here various kinds of civil society organizations which work in the area of environment and climate in Russia, and they can come in various forms. I also mentioned here that Greenpeace and WWF Russia are probably the two largest players. And then there's also this umbrella organization, which is called Russian Social Ecological Union, which does support and also capacity building for many small regional and local organizations. And then what we've also seen recently in the last few years is a growth of activists, private individual activists, groups of activists, bloggers, which just get united around a particular environmental cause, start a campaign in many regions across Russia, and they're just trying to do something about it. Sorry, I realized I was not actually showing it. Wait a minute. Yeah. So which problems and which topics were the most important for Russian environmental civil society groups in the last few years. Here, I would argue that those are mostly local or hyper-local environmental issues. So that can be, for example, there's a landfill next to a city which is badly managed, like or mismanaged, and then you can actually smell it, and then maybe some water like discharges from this landfill comes into like rivers or waters, and so there's a local group building up and they're trying to protest against that landfill. Or there are also groups who try to protect parks and green urban areas from demolishing them and from building new infrastructure or new housing. I mean, there are like urban green is a huge topic for these groups. Another area where they also quite a number of such groups is air or water quality. So there are quite a number of groups who are actually working on these topics. And now I have my own division of these groups, and I usually divide them into following categories, which I also mentioned on this website. So as I mentioned, there are quite a number of protest groups building around a particular cause. And some of them then become professional NGOs later, but some of them just leave as long as the cause exists. And then either they lose or they win, then yeah, they dissolve. There are also a number of groups who work not as a protest group, but try to build infrastructure, not always material infrastructure, but sometimes also teaching people about sustainability, teaching people about environmental awareness. For example, there's a Russia-wide movement called Раздельный сбор, like separate collection. And what they do is that across cities in Russia, they provide community-based infrastructure for separate waste collection. And then they bring various fractions of waste to recycling facilities outside of the city. So as long as there is no municipal infrastructure, they do this. But then they also participate very actively in advocacy for more sustainable, more solutions that come in line with the circular economy principles. And they also do a lot of campaigns and educational programs and awareness raising programs. So they're very active, I can say. And there are also a number of other groups which work in the area of sustainable, responsible consumption, actually telling people what is right, what's the most sustainable way, responsible way to behave, to consume. And so a number of these groups have appeared over the last few years, and we've really seen a development of the sector and a growing interest in this topic. And then there are also a number of the so-called what I call watchdogs. They're usually the ones who either try to control public spending on environmental and climate programs. There are also a few groups who demand access to environmental information, because it's very often that across Russia that environmental information, including information on air quality or water quality, might not be accessible, or it might not be reliable, or it might not be also understandable, because it's very often that, say, air quality data comes in form of very long tables, which are like not very accessible for the local community. And so these groups are trying to deal with this. There've been a number of communities-led projects and civil society-led projects in cities in southern Ural and southern Siberia, which still have very high levels of air pollution coming from coal generation and industrial facilities. They've been trying to introduce like civic systems of air control, of monitoring of air quality, giving out to people very simple device to measure air pollution, and then building this device and connecting this device into networks, and providing real-time data on a map of air pollution in the city, and then showing how this data contradicts official city provided data on air pollution. So there have been a number of such groups. I also say here that very often for climate change, issues of climate change and biodiversity, those are the topics which mostly professional environmentalists and like expert group work. However, we also do have an emerging movement of Friday for Future Russia, and like other climate-led activists. And it looks like climate change is becoming more and more important for young people who do not only work on this local and hyper-local causes, the ones I was telling you about, but also trying to look a bit beyond it and also see what kind of global role Russia plays and what is the future of oil and gas and what can we do about it. Oops, probably missed this one. Wait a minute. Switch to my other presentation. Right, and now I'm switching to the third part of my talk, and that would be more specifically about food, water, and sustainability, because those are the main topics for the week. And I thought I would give you a very brief outlook what the food and food security situation looks like in Russia. So here's some basic facts about the food sector in Russia. Um, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has developed itself into a large exporter of wheat and a number of other grains, including barley and rice, but wheat is the main agricultural export product of Russia. Wheat sector has developed throughout the last 20 years, and it's actually looks like it's contributing more and more to Russia's GDP. So yeah, it's an important agricultural sector. Now, in terms of meat and dairy, Russia still does not produce enough for its own consumption. There have been some modest development of the sector in the last few years, ever since the Western sanctions have been introduced on Russia following the 2014 events in Ukraine. And then Russia introduced the so-called counter sanctions, which prohibited, say, imports of European Union produced meat, dairy, and a number of other agricultural and food products. And so that led to somewhat development of meat and dairy, but still like a percentage of it, certain percentage of it is being imported to Russia. Now, fruits and vegetables, a lot of imports coming from other countries, mainly from the Central Asian countries and Caucasus countries, like former Soviet Union republics, but also quite a lot from the Middle East and other parts of the world. Now, there's a very interesting aspect which I would also like to tell you about. So, like I mentioned here, like berries and mushrooms, and I actually have a very somewhat amusing picture on this one. So for large groups of population living next to nature, picking up mushrooms and picking up berries, there's even a very special word in Russia saying dikaros, which means something which grows wildly, and you can just go and pick it up. That makes a very important part of income of local communities. That is quite surprising to see, especially if you first travel to Moscow, and Moscow, like I don't know, a future-like city with modern streets, modern infrastructure, and people talking about, I don't know, global trends, and I don't know, people just don't really live that differently from many other global cities. But then if you travel even 700 miles away from Moscow and you come to a decent village where there might not be that many jobs, surprisingly, quite a lot of local communities would make their income picking up berries and mushrooms and then just selling them, not selling them like on their own, but selling them to larger companies who then process them and make them into like processed berries and jams and something else. So that actually makes that was quite a surprise to me as well. So whenever I travel to really like they must not always be a very distant part of Russia. As I said, sometimes they're located right in the middle of the country, say between Moscow and St. Petersburg, but you will still find people doing this. And that is obviously a very interesting story. That's almost hard to believe that something like this could be happening in the 21st century. And those people would also not be indigenous communities. Those would be people, for example, living in a village or a small town which used to have other jobs before, say in late Soviet Union, but now they just love to do this. So yeah, another interesting story is the growth of local agricultural production. So quite a number of people turned to production of honey and other honey products. This has also been one of the recent more or less success events of Russian agriculture, and Russia actually exports quite a lot of honey and honey products. Then there's also like indigenous groups living in the north. They obviously make their own living with reindeer and reindeer meat and other like wild game, which they can find, and then they sell elsewhere to the so-called mainland Russia. So in a way, this very like hyper-local agricultural production of particular kind of agricultural food is being seen as something which is an interesting trend and also a somewhat successful trend in Russia. And it's also connected with another trend, which I mentioned here, and that is growing demand for bioproducts and organic products. Well, basically, like traditionally, if you live in a large city in Russia, it was very hard to get like fresh products from the farm or for products which you can really trace their origin of. Once again, with the growing environmental awareness, that has been changing, and more people have been putting more demand onto bioproducts or products produced sustainably and ethically. So that sector is also growing, and there are a number of farmers who are now also switching to community-supported agriculture models. Like you can, as well as in the US and European countries, other European countries, if you live in a city, you can actually start like make a particular deal with the farmer, and you will be getting maybe like, I don't know, once a week a basket of seasonal vegetables, and then maybe some meat and eggs and dairy. The really big question here is obviously logistics, because in case of Russia, land costs vary. Say if you have land somewhere around Moscow, around St. Petersburg, and those where most of your customers will be, people who are willing to pay much more, to pay premium for organically, locally produced food products. Land around these areas is super expensive, and also paying for everything, land, electricity, and heating, and like yeah, all other resources. So in a way, but then if you're somewhere further away, well, land can be much cheaper because there are like very few people around. You might be having issues connected to electricity grid, or you might be having issues getting other like infrastructure connections. And you also have obviously very big challenge of actually delivering your products, especially durable products, to your customers, which can be living elsewhere. But as I said, this sector is developing, so we'll probably see quite a lot of interesting developments of this in the near future. Now, to touch upon water issue, Russia has world's second largest freshwater resources. I didn't write like freshwater, yeah, it's like fresh, sweet water, fresh water, after Brazil. And as I mentioned already in the beginning, like what is a perfect example of this European Asian part of Russia divide, because we have more people and more demand for water in the European part of Russia, but most of Russia's water resources, like the large and the great Siberian rivers, are in the Asian part of Russia. So the whole question is like how to ensure passing of these resources. I mean, so far, like the water deficit issues have only really been an issue for the south of Russia, and we've had a number of droughts. We'll see like how that situation will be developing, but most issues connected with water is actually water contamination from municipal sector and sometimes industries. Now, whenever I speak to the economists about what the future of Russia's economy could be like after the era of oil and gas, many of them also mentioned that, well, first of all, yes, agriculture and climate smart agriculture and also sustainable agriculture, but also water intensive industries, because like having so much water available, and also included, if this water is included into industrial cycles in a sustainable way. Russia can also be one of the main producers of water-intensive products, whatever this could be in the economy of the future. So anyway, there are a lot of thoughts about how this water can be used and how this water can be used sustainably, but so far it's still a question for the future. And now a few final words about sustainability. I've already mentioned that it's becoming a trend in Russia, and there's a growing demand for information, but also practices on sustainable consumption and responsible lifestyles. And so sustainability and environment and climate is what local governments and companies start reacting to and saying something, at least doing something. And I'm also convinced that someone who is very much engaged in international cooperation between other Russia and other countries on these tracks. I also believe that it's one of the so-called tracks which can actually provide good stories for international cooperation between Russia and other countries, including Russia and the US. And I hope that that will actually see further development and more active cooperation in the sectors between the two countries. I will stop here and I will be open to your questions, comments. Yes, thank you.